Now that you have your application created, we're going to go through and over the next few guides, we're going to build out a small React application that utilizes TypeScript. Now, the focus of this is not going to be on teaching you anything and everything there is to know about React. You're definitely going to learn a lot about React along the way, but I have other courses that go into a lot of detail on understanding React. The purpose of these guides is to show you real world examples of how TypeScript can be used. So we're going to build out just a very small application, but throughout the entire build, we're going to be writing in TypeScript. And so hopefully this really helps you, because there's one thing, it's one thing to learn the syntax and kind of just the details of how a programming language like TypeScript works. But it takes it to a whole nother level when you can actually see that you can take all of those language constructs and you can put them together to build an application. And hopefully it'll give you a good on-ramp for whatever you're looking to build, whether it's with React, whether it's React Native, Angular, Vue, anything like that. So in this guide, we're going to see how we can build a component using React and TypeScript. And I already have a few examples here, this hello component and this hello with hooks component in the template, but we're going to get rid of these because we want to build out our very own. And I'm going to show you how we can build them out from scratch, and also how we're going to be able to leverage some of the power of TypeScript with that. So I deleted those files, and so we can come into the app component, and this is located in src components app, and we'll remove those references, and I'll remove them from here. So this app component, this is the starting point of all of the components. So everything that we write is going to go inside of here, but we're also going to see how we can import different components and how we can kind of manage all of our internal dependencies. So we're going to build out a very small little invoicing application. So it's going to give us the ability to create invoices and then mark them as paid and then see that full list of them. So we're going to do that over the next few guides. So in the very first guide, let's create a component, and we'll put it right here in the same file for right now, and then I'll show you how we can create them, organize them in other files later on. So for right here, let's create one, and let's call it our invoice list component. Now there are multiple ways that you could do this. So you could write a functional component and call it, function and then invoice list, and then from there inside of invoice list we could write our React code. I personally really like the syntax, this fat arrow syntax. This is what I use. I know other React developers and TypeScript developers that use the function syntax. It's completely up to you. As far as TypeScript and React are concerned, with these functional components, there's literally no difference. So it is up to your own personal preference. So I'm going to follow my own preference here. And so I'm going to say this is going to be my invoice list. It's going to be a fat arrow component. And then inside, we are going to return, and this is very important, that we return a value. And in this case, we're returning what is called JSX. Now, JSX, like I said, this course is not all about React and that kind of thing. You got this course because it's a TypeScript course. So I want TypeScript to be the focus. What you can think of JSX is a way of being able to write what looks like HTML code, placing it directly inside of your components, but behind the scenes, it's actually JavaScript and TypeScript code. It simply looks a lot like HTML. So inside of here, for right now, let's just see if this is working. So I'm going to put inside a div, I'm going to put a h1, and then I'll say invoices. And the way that you can call this invoice list from our app component is inside of this div, I'm going to say invoices or invoice list, just like this, and write it out like this with this tag. So it looks a lot like HTML even when we're calling components. Now this is something that is important, and I do want to make a point of, because if you've never used React or JSX or anything like that, it might be a little bit confusing. The capitalization is very important. If I were to call this invoice list with this naming convention, then this, as you can see, this already is throwing a TypeScript error. And the reason is because behind the scenes, remember I said JSX, behind the scenes, it's actual JavaScript code that goes and it creates these virtual nodes, and it creates the div elements and the tags and all of the things that actually get rendered on the page. The capitalization is important because with how JSX parses everything, then when it sees a capital in a tag like this, then what it does is it thinks, okay, this is a component. If it sees a lowercase letter, like our div, it thinks that it's a tag, an HTML tag. So that's the reason why the capitalization is important, and that's the way I'm going to be using it throughout this entire little module. So I'm going to hit save, and opening up the console by typing Control tilde. You can also go up to where it says terminal, and then you can say new terminal, and it's going to do the same thing. And then I'm going to run npm run start, which is going to start up our local server. You can see it starts it up with our commands that we talked about that were in that package JSON file. If everything compiles successfully, then we should be able to open this up. So I'm going to open up Google Chrome, go to localhost 3000, and there you go. It says invoices. And for the sake of making this easy, I'm going to shrink this on the right hand side and then do this with our browser so we can actually see this at the same time. And I spoke a little bit about hot reloading, and that means that when I hit save on one of these files, it will actually come in save and reload and refresh the page. So say that I added a h2 tag here and said something else. When I hit save, notice on the right hand side it auto refreshes. This is specific to the React Webpack dev server that I'm using, and it's nice. So you're not going to get that with every single framework that you work with, but you do here with React, and so I like that. Okay, so this is our invoice list, and right now it's not really doing very much. We could have really put each one of these div elements inside of here, inside of our app component. So let's see how we can actually extend this and how we can make this pretty useful. Well, what we can do is we can actually pass in data. So I'm going to create an object inside of our app component here. And this is going to be a standard TypeScript object. So I'm going to say const, and we'll just call this data. And so we're going to set this equal to some data points. So here we could give this, say, the name of the customer. So customer name. And then this is going to be, in this case, we'll say our customer name is Google. And then we're going to pass in some invoices. So these are the actual invoices that we're eventually going to iterate over. So these invoices are going to be an array, and it's going to be an array of objects. So we're going to have a ID, and in this case, ID is going to be 1, 2, 3 for the first one. The name is going to be, we'll call this just dev work, doesn't matter. And then let's give it a total. And for this total, we'll say that it was $20. Okay, and then we can go and we can create a few more of these. So we can say ID of 456, more dev work. This time it was for $50, and then we'll do one more, 789, and then something different, just so we can see the differences in each one of these. And this one will be for $100. Okay, so this is our basic data structure. We have our data object, then we have a customer name, and then we have invoices. This is mimicking something that you might get if you made an API call. So say that you had some outside API or an API server that you built out that returns some JSON data. That is exactly what this would look like. So that's why we're setting that up like that. Okay, so how can I get this data object here? And once again, we're mimicking what we might get from a server. How can I pass this data, all of these invoices and this name, into this invoice list? Well, for that, we can use what are called props, which are short for properties. So the way that you can set props and send props with a component is inside of this invoice list here, we can pass a name. And this name can be anything that you want. So this could be invoice data, just like this, and then we can pass in data. And we're getting a little error here, which is good because I'm going to show you how we can fix this. But I want to show you that this name could be anything you want. It could be invoice data, it could be data, it could be ASDF if you want it. It's completely up to you. So I'm going to call it invoice data because I think that makes sense. So how do I pass this data, all of these invoices and this customer name, how can I pass it to this invoice list so that I can work with it up in this function? Well, I can pass in props right here. And so now notice that TypeScript no longer is showing me an error here. And so it's no longer showing this error. It's moved up to where it says props, and it says props is declared, but its value is never read. This is starting to get into the power of using TypeScript inside of a React application. And when I first started learning React, I was using just vanilla JavaScript, and those first few React applications I built were very buggy and very difficult to work with and maintain, and it was because I was just using vanilla JavaScript, which didn't really give me a lot of guidance on how my data should be structured and how to call my functions and what the data integrity rules should look like. That's where TypeScript came in, because I might have a situation like this where I have this invoice list component, and if I want to call this from some other part of the application, I would have to go to the invoice list and then see each one of the data points that were needed to match those up. But what I'm able to do with TypeScript is I'm able to actually create rules that these components have to follow. So let me show you how to do that. And this is our kind of our first way of jumping in to see the way TypeScript can be used in React. We've been writing all TypeScript code, but now you can see the power of it here. So with invoice list, what I'm going to do is right above it, and you can put this anywhere. When we move this into its own file, we're going to be able to, you're going to see how we can organize all this code. I'm going to create a TypeScript interface, and I'm going to call this invoice list props, and then inside of here, I'm going to say what these props should look like. So I'm saying that we should have a customer name, which is of type string, and then I should have a set of invoices, which here, these are going to be an array of objects. So they need to have an ID of a number, a name of type string, and then a total of type string. And then that is going to be an array of these objects. And if you remember back to when we talked about interfaces in TypeScript, this is exactly what we did. So what I can do now is I can say invoice list props is going to be the set of props. These are the rules that this invoice list is going to require if you want to work with it. So now notice that error's gone away. And now what we've said is if you send props to this invoice list, they have to follow these set of rules. So I'll hit save here. And now let's see. Okay, well, we have an error. What is that? Now I'll zoom out so we can actually see this. And this is kind of following the pattern of building these applications in TypeScript. TypeScript, because browsers can't understand it the way they can with JavaScript, TypeScript is really just for you as a developer. It's for you and the application and the text editor guiding you along the process of building and maintaining your applications. So right here it's saying, okay, you said invoice data is the name of the prop that you're wanting to pass in, but that's not actually matching here. So right now we passed in the type of data we want, but we actually have to wrap this up. So let's look at what this error says. So it says failed to compile, and it says type invoice data is not assignable to the set of props that we supplied. Okay, well that's actually a good thing. So now I can take invoice data, because that's a name that we want to use, and inside of our interface I can say invoice data is the object, and then I can pass in customer name and invoices, and look at that, the error went away. So what's pretty cool about this is this gives us the ability to wrap up multiple types of data. So say that I want to have invoice data, but maybe there's some other prop that I want to pass in. I could even pass in something like maybe a logo or something like that. And let's actually do that. Let's grab a logo, and this is going to be of type string. And so now you can see that we have another error, and this is good because what this is saying we're calling this invoice list from some other part of the application. We remembered to put in the invoice data, but then we forgot about the logo, and if the logo is required, then it's going to tell us that. And so we can simply look at that, and we can hover over, and it says property logo is missing. This is really cool. This is where I started to really fall in love with using TypeScript in my applications, because it was almost like when I was working with TypeScript, it was almost like I had a really smart developer with a completely photographic memory sitting right next to me. And as I was writing out my code, that developer would be like, oh, hey, you forgot you need to pass in a logo for this invoice list component. And then I'd be able to go do that and fix it. So there are some other things you can do with the interfaces. Remember that I said that interface elements can also be optional. So say if we want the logo for some people, but not for everybody. Well, I can say logo with a question mark. Now the error has gone away, because now what we've done is we say that that logo is optional. So let's hit save, and everything here is working once again. And this video has been going on for a while, so we're just going to finish it off by showing how we can actually pull in this data, and then we'll take a break and we'll continue on. So we have this invoice list, and we have our props. How can we actually call these? Well, I can, inside of invoices, let's say that we want to get rid of these titles, and inside of invoices we want to use our customer name. Well, inside of curly brackets I can say props dot. Now because I'm using TypeScript once again, now the IDE, the text editor, is walking me through the data that I have access to. Because I define that interface, it says, hey, you have access to invoice data, and it's required because it doesn't have a question mark, or I have access to a logo. Well, I want the invoice data, and the logo, it even shows, because as a question mark, it means it's optional, which means what that tells me is that I need to wrap that up in a conditional. So if I called the logo, I wouldn't just call the logo and pass it into an image tag or something like that, because then I might get an error because the logo isn't required. I can't trust that it's always going to be there. But an invoice data object is, because I know that TypeScript won't even compile if that data is missing. So that's really helpful. So I'm going to say invoice data dot customer name. Hit save, and there you go. Now you have Google right there. Now we can also perform a little refactor here, because this would be kind of tiresome to say props.invoiceData.customer name, and then when we want to iterate over all of the invoices, then we're going to have to say props.invoiceData.invoices. That wouldn't really be nice. So instead what I can do is I can perform destructuring here. And this is something that is not specific to TypeScript. It also is in JavaScript. And I can say const and then have my object here, set that equal to props.invoiceData. Now inside of these curly brackets, now I have access to the customer name. And I also have access to invoices. Now inside of this header tag, now I can get rid of props.invoiceData, call the customer name by itself, hit save, and you can see everything there is still working. So in this guide, let's kind of summarize what we've done. We have created a functional component using TypeScript and React. And then we've seen how we could leverage JSX to render out elements on the page. And then we saw how we were able to work with properties to pass data from one component, and this is called the parent component, and then the component that there's different terminology. You can call this a child component or a owned or controlled component. This is, well, for right now, to make it easy, we'll call it a child component. And we saw how we can pass data to that child component. And then lastly, we saw how we were able to leverage TypeScript interfaces to define a set of rules that data has to live by. So we saw how we can set very strict rules on what data can be passed in, what that data needs to look like, and then we saw how by doing that, it created that set of restrictions and those guidelines to help us as we're building it out. But as we saw, that also gave us really helpful hints for what data we had access to, and the text editor started to automatically give us recommendations. It showed us all of the data that we could use in this child component. So great job if you went through that. You've actually built out your own functional component and used properties with React. In the next guide, we're going to see how we can take an array of objects, and we're going to see how we can dynamically iterate and create a full list of elements using React mixed with TypeScript.